While I was under anesthesia for emergency gallbladder surgery, my husband sat in a lawyer's office 12 minutes from the hospital and signed our restaurant over to his brother. He didn't tell me. He didn't ask me. He signed a transfer of ownership on Rialto, the restaurant we'd built together over 14 years, into a business worth just under $2 million, while I was lying in a recovery room with a breathing tube taped to my cheek, and he thought, I believe, that by the time I was well enough to notice, it would already be finished, already irreversible, already done. He forgot one thing, but I'll get to that. I'm Camille Renard. I'm 48 years old, and Rialto is mine in every sense that has ever actually mattered, though it took a hospital bed and a betrayal I never saw coming for me to understand exactly how true that was, on paper as well as in practice. This is Silent Revenge, where we sit with the quiet women who finally stop apologizing, the ones who kept the peace until keeping it cost too much. If you're new here, grab your coffee, get comfortable, and subscribe, because tonight's story starts in a hospital bed and ends somewhere that surprised even me. You should know who I am before I tell you what my husband did, because the two things don't match the way his family tells it. I trained as a chef in Lyon before I ever set foot in the United States, apprenticed under a notoriously difficult woman named Odile Marchand, who ran a 2 Michelin star kitchen, and who taught me, among other things, that the person who understands the numbers behind a kitchen survives long after the person who only understands the flavors. I came to the States at 26 with $4,000, a knife roll, and a work visa, and I spent 6 years cooking in other people's kitchens in Chicago before I met Desmond Reyes at a wine distributor's tasting event, a soft-spoken, charming man who worked in restaurant finance and talked, that first night, about wanting to build something of his own someday. We married 2 years later, and 3 years after that, we opened Rialto together in a converted warehouse space in the West Loop. Me running the kitchen, Desmond running the front of house and the books. A partnership that made sense on paper and, for a long time, made sense in practice too. Odile used to say that most chefs fail, not because their food is bad, but because they never learn to read a P&L statement. That talent without literacy in the numbers eventually gets swallowed by someone who understands both. I took that lesson seriously enough that I spent my 1 day off a week during my Lyon apprenticeship sitting in on the restaurant's bookkeeping sessions, unpaid, uninvited really, just watching and asking questions until the accountant started explaining things to me unprompted. That habit followed me to Chicago, and later to Rialto, and it's the single decision, more than any recipe I ever perfected, that ended up protecting everything I built. I want to be precise about the ownership structure, because it matters enormously to what happened later. Rialto was structured as an LLC from day one, with membership interests split according to actual capital contribution, the way any properly built restaurant partnership should be. I'd put in my full $4,000 of savings, plus a small inheritance from my grandmother that came through 18 months into planning, roughly $60,000 total. Desmond had contributed less capital, but had secured, through his finance connections, a critical early loan that got us through build-out, and we'd agreed, at the time, on a 60-40 split in his favor, reflecting his financing contribution, with the explicit understanding, documented in our original operating agreement, that my ownership percentage would increase over time based on sweat equity clauses tied to the restaurant's profitability, since I was the one physically running the kitchen 60-plus hours a week, while Desmond increasingly split his time between Rialto and outside consulting work. By year 12, those sweat equity clauses had done exactly what they were designed to do. My ownership stake had grown from 40% to 62%, formally amended and filed with the state, documented in our operating agreement amendments, because Rialto's profitability over those years had been driven overwhelmingly by the kitchen, by 2 James Beard semi-finalist nominations, by a loyal following built one perfect plate at a time, by the 80-hour weeks I put in while Desmond's outside consulting work grew increasingly demanding and increasingly separate from the day-to-day of the restaurant we'd built together. I remember the specific conversation, years earlier, when we'd formalized the first of those amendments. Desmond had been the one to raise it actually, unprompted, sitting at our dining table with a bottle of wine between us, saying that it felt dishonest for the ownership split to still reflect a 60-40 structure built around an initial loan when the day-to-day reality of who was actually driving the business's growth had shifted so dramatically. I remember being surprised and moved that he'd noticed and named it himself, rather than waiting for me to raise it. We'd gone to an attorney together, drafted the amendment together, and I'd felt, at the time, that it was one of the clearest expressions of partnership our marriage had ever produced. A formal, documented acknowledgement that fairness mattered more to both of us than the comfort of an outdated arrangement. I think about that memory often now, in the aftermath of everything that happened with Julian, because it makes the later betrayal sting in a very particular way. The man who once sat across that same dining table, insisting on fairness toward me, was the same man who, years later, tried to quietly undo it while I was unconscious on an operating table. Both of those men were real. I've had to learn to hold that complexity rather than flattening him into either a villain or a victim of his own family patterns. Desmond's younger brother, Julian, had never worked a single day at Rialto. Julian had bounced between failed business ventures for over a decade: a food truck that folded within a year after a dispute with the city over permitting, a wine import business that collapsed under mismanaged inventory, and a partner who turned out to be siphoning funds. A fast casual concept in Wicker Park that closed after 8 months, when the build-out costs ran nearly triple the original projection. Each failure had been followed by the same family ritual: a tense Sunday dinner at Desmond's parents' house, his mother quietly tearful, his father delivering some version of a lecture about responsibility, and Desmond, sitting there as the older brother who'd actually built something lasting, absorbing a strange, misplaced guilt for his own success that never seemed to fully make sense to me, though I understood, even then, that guilt rarely operates on logic. Desmond had always harbored this particular, unexamined guilt about being the more successful brother, the one their parents praised, the one who'd built something real, while Julian kept failing. He'd quietly loaned Julian money twice over the years. Small amounts, a few $1,000s here and there, always without telling me the full extent of it until well after the fact, always accompanied by a private hope, I think, that this time would be different. That guilt, I understand now, looking back, was the seed of everything that happened, though I didn't see its full shape until I was lying in a hospital bed with a breathing tube in my throat. I'd been having abdominal pain for 2 weeks before the surgery, pain I kept pushing through because Rialto was in the middle of its busiest stretch, a James Beard announcement coming up that we thought might finally land us the actual nomination instead of just the semi-finalist nod. And I didn't have room in my calendar, I told myself, for anything that would take me out of the kitchen. By the time I finally went to urgent care, my gallbladder had become so inflamed the doctor told me I was one bad night away from a rupture, and I was admitted for emergency surgery within 6 hours of walking through the door. Desmond sat with me before they took me back, held my hand, told me everything would be fine, that he'd handle Rialto for the few days I'd be out, that I should focus on healing. I remember the fluorescent lights overhead, the particular chemical smell of the pre-op area, the nurse checking my IV line one more time before wheeling me toward the double doors, and Desmond's face, the last thing I saw clearly before the anesthesiologist asked me to count backward from 10. I remember thinking, in the last clear moments before the anesthesia took hold, how grateful I was to have a partner steady enough to hold things together while I recovered. How lucky I felt, at 48 years old, to have built both a marriage and a business that could withstand an unexpected week of my absence without either one faltering. I want you to sit with that detail for a moment, the specific, genuine gratitude I felt in that moment, because it matters to understanding exactly how deep the betrayal that followed actually went, and how disorienting it was to later realize that the same 12 minutes of driving distance that separated my hospital bed from Foster Klein's office had been used, during the exact window of my greatest trust in him, for something so entirely opposite to what I believed was happening. Here's what nobody in that recovery room knew. What I myself wouldn't learn for 11 more days. While I was in surgery, and in the disoriented, medicated hours immediately after, Desmond drove 12 minutes from the hospital to the office of an attorney named Foster Klein, a family friend of the Reyes family for 2 decades, and executed a transfer agreement assigning his full membership interest in Rialto Restaurant Group LLC to Julian Reyes, in exchange for what the paperwork described as past financial consideration, a vague, undocumented claim that Julian had informally loaned Desmond money years earlier that had never been formally repaid, a claim I have since found no supporting documentation for whatsoever, despite an exhaustive search. What Desmond either didn't understand or understood and gambled on my not noticing quickly enough to stop was that his membership interest, following 12 years of sweat equity amendments, represented only 38% of the LLC. He didn't own 60% anymore. He hadn't owned 60% in years. And under the terms of our operating agreement, terms Desmond himself had helped draft, terms that existed specifically to protect the restaurant from exactly this kind of unilateral maneuver, any transfer of membership interest to a party outside the existing membership required written consent from members holding a supermajority of the remaining interest. I held 62%. Nothing Desmond signed that day was valid without my consent. He needed my signature to make it real, and I was under anesthesia when he tried to give away something that was never fully his to give. I found out on day 4 after surgery, still moving slowly, still on pain medication, when I finally opened my laptop to check on Rialto's ordering schedule and found an email from Foster Klein's office addressed to me, informing me, as a member of the LLC, of a recent membership interest assignment and requesting my countersignature to formalize the transfer, along with an updated cap table showing Julian Reyes now listed as a 38% member in place of Desmond. I read that email 4 times before I fully understood what I was looking at. Then I called our own restaurant's accountant, a meticulous woman named Priscilla Ozawa who'd handled Rialto's books for 9 years and who I trusted completely, and asked her, my voice shaking in a way I hated, to confirm the current ownership percentages on record with the state. 62-40, as of the last amendment, she said, filed 3 years ago. Why? I didn't answer her question directly. I asked her instead to pull every filed document related to the LLC's ownership history and email them to me immediately, and I sat in that hospital bed, IV still in my arm, and read 14 years of my own restaurant's paper trail, with a clarity that pain medication should have made impossible but somehow didn't. Desmond visited that evening, brought flowers, asked how I was feeling, and I watched him do it. Sit in the chair beside my hospital bed, ask about my pain levels, mention that Rialto's dinner service had gone smoothly the night before, without saying a single word about what he'd done 4 days earlier, while I was unconscious on an operating table. I want to describe what that felt like, because it's the part of this story that still catches in my throat more than the legal maneuvering itself. I looked at my husband of 16 years, a man who'd held my hand before surgery and told me to focus on healing, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that he had used the exact window of my greatest vulnerability to try to take something from me that I'd built with my own 2 hands, and that he'd been sitting in my hospital room for the past 4 days without the courage to tell me himself. I remember setting the laptop down on the hospital blanket after reading that email, staring at the ceiling tile above my bed, running through 14 years of memory trying to find some earlier sign I'd missed, some conversation, some hint, some moment where Desmond had tried to raise this with me, and I'd been too distracted by the restaurant's daily demands to fully hear him. I couldn't find one. There wasn't one. This hadn't been a slow, telegraphed decision I'd simply failed to notice building. It had been made, apparently, in the space of days, possibly hours, timed with a precision that could not have been accidental. I didn't confront him that night. I want to explain why, because it matters to the rest of this story. I was still recovering physically, my judgment still soft around the edges from medication, and I've learned over many years running a demanding kitchen that the worst decisions get made in the heat of the first reaction. I needed to understand exactly what had happened, exactly what my rights actually were, before I said a single word to Desmond about any of it. I called Priscilla back that night and asked her to connect me with an attorney, not Foster Klein, obviously, but someone entirely outside the Reyes family's orbit. She recommended a business litigation attorney named Selena Ashford Vance, a formidable woman who specialized in exactly this kind of ownership dispute, and I had my first call with her from my hospital bed the following morning, speaking quietly so the nurse checking my vitals wouldn't overhear. Selena walked me through the reality of the situation with the same clear, unemotional precision I try to bring to a difficult service. The transfer Desmond had attempted was not valid without my consent, as a supermajority member. Full stop. Foster Klein's office had either not properly reviewed our operating agreement before drafting the transfer, which seemed unlikely for an attorney of his experience, or had drafted it anyway, hoping I wouldn't understand my own rights well enough to object in time. A gamble, Selena said bluntly, that families sometimes make when they assume the person they're maneuvering around won't fight back. She walked me through the specific mechanics over that first call, and I remember writing notes on the back of a hospital discharge pamphlet because it was the only paper within reach. Under Illinois LLC law, she explained, and under the specific supermajority consent clause we'd built into our operating agreement 7 years earlier, Any transfer purporting to assign membership interest without proper written consent from the required threshold of remaining members was void from inception, not merely voidable, meaning it had never actually taken legal effect at all, regardless of whether Foster Klein's office had filed anything with the state. That distinction mattered enormously, she said, because it meant I wasn't in the position of having to fight to undo something that had already happened. Legally, nothing had happened yet. Julian's name on that cap table update was, in the eyes of the law, simply incorrect information that needed correcting, not an ownership stake that needed to be clawed back. There's a second issue worth flagging, Selena added, more carefully. Depending on how deliberately your husband and his attorney structured this, timed specifically around your incapacitation during surgery, there could be an argument for undue haste or even an attempt to exploit your temporary incapacity, which some jurisdictions treat quite seriously in the context of major asset transfers. I'm not suggesting criminal exposure here. This isn't that kind of case from what you've described. But it's worth you understanding the full weight of what was attempted procedurally before you decide how you want to handle this within your marriage. I sat with that assessment for a long moment, the IV line still taped to the back of my hand, and asked her the question that had been sitting underneath everything else since I'd first read that email. What do you want to do? Selena asked me, echoing back the same question I'd been asking myself for 4 days. Legally, you have every right to simply refuse to countersign, and this transfer dies on the page. But I sense there's more here you want to address. There was. I spent the next 6 days in that hospital bed, and then another week recovering at home, gathering every piece of documentation I needed, while Desmond continued behaving as though nothing had happened, as though I hadn't already seen the email, as though the man who'd tried to give away 60% of a business he no longer fully owned could simply wait me out until I was too tired or too grateful to be alive to notice. I let him believe that. It cost me something to perform that particular kind of patience, watching him move through our shared kitchen at home making tea for me, asking about my recovery, all while I sat with the knowledge of exactly what he'd done, but I've learned, in 14 years of running a professional kitchen, that the person who reacts first rarely controls the outcome. The person who waits until they fully understand the situation almost always does. Rialto's staff noticed something was off before I ever said a word to any of them, the way a good kitchen crew always notices when the people running the place are carrying something heavy. Marisol, our longtime sous chef who'd worked beside me for 9 years, pulled me aside during prep one evening, about 10 days after my surgery, and asked, carefully, whether everything was all right between me and Desmond. I told her, honestly, that we were working through something difficult, without giving details, and she nodded and said only, whatever it is, chef, this kitchen runs because of you. Everybody back here knows that. Even on nights you're not physically standing at the pass. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that, coming from someone who'd watched me build Rialto's actual day-to-day operation from the inside for nearly a decade. Someone whose opinion of my worth had never once depended on a piece of paper filed with the state. The confrontation happened on a Sunday, 3 weeks after my surgery. Once I was physically strong enough that I no longer worried the stress of it might set back my recovery. I asked Desmond to sit down at our kitchen table, our home kitchen, not Rialto's, and I put Priscilla's ownership documentation and Selena's legal memo on the table between us, and I asked him, directly, to explain what he'd done while I was under anesthesia. He didn't deny it. I want to give him that much credit, even now. He sat there, and he told me that Julian had come to him months earlier, desperate, facing eviction from his apartment after his latest venture collapsed, asking for help, and that Desmond, carrying decades of guilt about being the golden child while his brother kept failing, had promised Julian something, a stake in Rialto, a way to finally feel like he had a piece of something real in the family, without ever discussing it with me, without ever checking whether he even had the legal standing to make good on that promise. When exactly did you promise him this? I asked. Before my surgery or after? Before, Desmond said quietly. Weeks before. I'd told him I'd figure out how to make it happen. I didn't have a plan yet. And then, your surgery got scheduled. And I think some part of me, I'm not proud of this, some part of me saw an opening. A window where I could just handle it quietly, get the paperwork done, present it to you afterward as something already settled, so you wouldn't have to sit through the actual negotiation of it, the arguing, the back and forth I assumed would happen if we discussed it together first. You assumed I'd say no. I assumed you'd want conditions, he said. Timelines, restrictions, maybe a smaller stake than what I'd already told Julian I'd try to get him. I didn't want to be the one telling my brother I couldn't deliver what I'd promised. So, I looked for the fastest path instead of the honest one. I didn't fully register how much had shifted with the amendments, he added. I know that sounds like an excuse. It's not meant as one, it's just true. You didn't check, I said. 14 years of building this together, and you didn't check what you actually owned before you tried to give away a piece of it to someone who's never worked a single shift in that kitchen. I panicked, he said. Julian was going to lose everything, and I've spent my whole life watching my parents treat him like the family disappointment. And some part of me thought, if I could just give him this one thing. While I was unconscious, I said. You did this while I was unconscious, Desmond. Not over dinner. Not in a conversation where I could have told you no, or told you we could find another way to help your brother that didn't involve giving away something that isn't entirely yours. You waited until I couldn't object. He didn't have an answer for that, because there wasn't a good one. I watched him understand, in real time, that the timing of what he'd done was its own separate betrayal, entirely apart from the legal impossibility of the transfer itself. What were you going to tell me? I asked, once I woke up and eventually noticed. Were you ever going to tell me yourself, or were you hoping I'd just find out from an email like I did? He was quiet for a long moment before answering, and the honesty of what he finally said was, in its own way, worse than if he'd lied. I hadn't fully worked that part out yet. I think some part of me was hoping the transfer would just quietly go through, get filed, become a fact on the ground before I had to have this exact conversation. That's a cowardly thing to admit. It's still the truth. I told him, that afternoon, exactly what was going to happen next. The transfer was void without my signature, and I wasn't providing it. Full stop. If he wanted to help Julian financially, we could discuss that as a couple, through legitimate means, a personal loan, a gift, anything that didn't touch the restaurant's ownership structure. But Rialto's ownership was not a family charity fund to be redistributed while I was on an operating table, and I needed him to understand, clearly and permanently, that any future attempt to touch the LLC's structure without my full knowledge and consent would end our marriage immediately, not as a threat, but as a simple statement of where my line now permanently sat. What followed wasn't a single dramatic confrontation, but a long, difficult 6 months of rebuilding trust that I'm still, honestly, not certain is fully rebuilt. Desmond's parents found out about 3 weeks after the confrontation at our kitchen table, and I want to describe that thread separately because it added its own complicated weight to everything. Desmond's mother, Rosalind, called me directly, something she'd never done in 16 years of marriage without Desmond on the line too, and she was crying before I'd even fully said hello. I don't know what to say to you, she told me. I raised that boy better than this. I don't know how he thought this was ever going to be all right. I told her, honestly, that I appreciated the call, but that this was really between Desmond and me to work through, and that I didn't need her to carry guilt on her son's behalf. She insisted on apologizing anyway, at length, and told me something I hadn't fully known before, that she and Desmond's father had quietly bailed Julian out of debt 3 separate times over the years, without ever telling Desmond the full extent of it, because they didn't want their older son resenting his brother, and that this pattern of quietly protecting Julian from consequences had, in Rosalind's own words, maybe taught both boys that someone would always eventually smooth things over, no matter how badly they'd been handled. I found that admission more useful than any apology, because it helped me understand the machinery behind what Desmond had done, not to excuse it, but to see clearly that I'd married into a family pattern decades in the making, one that had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with how 2 parents had managed their son's rivalry since childhood. Desmond's father, Augusto, never called at all, which told its own story. Desmond mentioned once, months later, that his father had said, privately, that he thought Desmond had been impulsive but not wrong to want to help his brother, a comment that stung Desmond more than he expected it to, because it suggested that even now, even after everything, his father still saw the situation primarily through the lens of Julian's need rather than the actual violation of trust involved. Desmond told me that comment was, in its own way, more clarifying than anything else that happened that spring. It helped him see, finally, the exact shape of the guilt he'd been carrying his whole life. Guilt that had never actually been his to carry in the first place, manufactured by 2 parents who'd spent decades quietly signaling that Julian's failures were somehow everyone's shared responsibility to absorb. Desmond formally rescinded the attempted transfer through Selena's office, a humiliating process for him that required a written retraction filed with the state and a somewhat awkward conversation with Foster Klein's office about why the paperwork he'd drafted was never going to be executed. Julian, for his part, sent me a stilted, clearly Desmond-prompted apology text that I never fully believed was sincere, though I accepted it graciously because holding a grudge against Julian specifically felt like misplaced energy. The real breach of trust here was never really about Julian's desperation. It was about my own husband's choice to act unilaterally, in secret, at the exact moment I was least able to defend myself. I want to give Julian's own story a bit more room here, though, because something unexpected happened with him over the following year that changed how I think about the whole situation. About 4 months after everything settled, Julian called me directly, without Desmond on the line, which surprised me enough that I almost didn't pick up. He said he'd been in therapy of his own, separate from anything Desmond and I were doing, and that he'd come to understand something uncomfortable about the pattern of his life. That he'd spent over a decade launching ventures fueled more by a desire to finally matter as much as his older brother than by any genuine passion for the businesses themselves. And that some part of him had known, even as Desmond made that promise to him, that accepting a stake in Rialto he hadn't earned would have felt hollow the moment the excitement wore off, the same way his previous ventures had. "I don't think I actually wanted the restaurant," he told me, with a rawness I hadn't heard from him before. "I think I wanted to finally be the brother who got handed something good, for once, instead of always being the one who needed rescuing. That's not the same thing as wanting to run a restaurant. I'm sorry it took almost losing something of yours for me to see that clearly." I told him I appreciated the honesty, and I meant it. And in the 18 months since, Julian has taken a steady, unglamorous job managing logistics for a regional food distributor, work that doesn't carry his name on any door but that he says, for the first time, feels genuinely his rather than borrowed against someone else's expectations. We're not close, Julian and I don't know that we ever will be. But I no longer feel the particular tension I used to feel around him at family gatherings, the low, constant hum of wondering what he might want from Desmond next. We went to couples counseling, something neither of us had ever needed in 16 years of marriage before that spring. Our therapist, a measured woman named Dr. Okafor, spent the first several sessions simply having each of us describe, separately, what trust had meant in our marriage before that spring, and I remember being surprised by how differently Desmond and I each answered that question. I'd always understood trust, in our partnership, as something built through consistent, verifiable action, the way you build trust with a business partner, proof over time. Desmond, it turned out, had always understood trust, more as an emotional current, something you extended based on love and good intention, rather than evidence, which helped me finally understand why he'd been capable of making a promise to Julian and acting on it without ever pausing to verify whether he had the legal standing to keep it. He'd been operating, the whole time, on a version of trust that didn't require the kind of verification I'd built my entire career around. I told our therapist, in one of the harder sessions, that what haunted me most wasn't the legal maneuvering itself. Selena had made clear from day one that the transfer never stood a real chance of holding up. But the fact that Desmond had been capable of making that choice at all, of sitting in a lawyer's office while I lay unconscious on an operating table, weighing his brother's guilt against his wife's ownership stake, and choosing his brother, at least in that moment, without a single conversation. "I wasn't choosing Julian over you," Desmond said. In that session, tears in his eyes for the first time since this whole thing began. I was drowning in guilt I've carried since we were kids, and I made an impulsive, terrible decision because I thought I could fix it before it ever needed to touch you at all. That doesn't make it okay. I understand now that it doesn't make it okay, but it also wasn't a calculated betrayal of you specifically. It was cowardice dressed up as generosity, and I'm ashamed of it every single day since. Dr. Okafor asked me, in that same session, what I would need from Desmond going forward, not as an apology, but as an ongoing practice, and I found myself answering with the same precision I'd bring to structuring a contract. I needed transparency around any financial decision above a certain threshold, discussed jointly, documented, no exceptions, regardless of how urgent or emotionally charged the underlying request felt in the moment. I needed him to understand that Julian's needs, however real, were never going to outrank a conversation with me about our shared assets, ever again, under any circumstance. Desmond agreed to all of it without argument, and more importantly, he's actually held to it in the 18 months since. A home renovation loan he wanted to help Julian secure last year went through an actual family conversation first, at my insistence, with terms we both signed off on together, rather than a unilateral promise made in guilt and executed in secret. I don't know, even now, exactly how much of that explanation I fully believe, and I think that uncertainty is something I'll likely carry for a long time, maybe permanently, folded into the rest of our marriage the way a bad scar folds into otherwise healthy tissue. What I do know is this: Rialto is still mine, still ours in the partnership that actually exists on paper, rather than the one Desmond briefly imagined he could rewrite. I received that James Beard nomination that year, the actual nomination, not just the semi-finalist nod. And I stood at that ceremony with Desmond beside me, clapping. And I thought about the version of that year where I might have woken up from surgery to find I'd lost 60% of my own restaurant to a brother-in-law who'd never once worked a dinner service in his life. I received that James Beard nomination that year, the actual nomination, not just the semi-finalist nod, and the ceremony itself fell only 2 months after the confrontation at our kitchen table, close enough that the whole experience still felt raw underneath the formal dress and the champagne. I remember standing backstage before the category announcement, Desmond beside me in a rented tuxedo, and feeling a strange, doubled kind of emotion, genuine pride in 14 years of work, finally being recognized at the level I'd always believed it deserved, tangled together with a fresh, still healing wound from a betrayal that had happened only weeks earlier in a lawyer's office 12 minutes from my hospital bed. When they called Rialto's name, I stood, and Desmond stood with me, applauding, and for one strange moment, walking toward the stage, I thought about Odile Marchand back in Lyon, and what she would have said about the whole tangled year, the surgery, the betrayal, the legal fight, and now this, a room full of industry peers finally acknowledging 14 years of exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous mastery she'd always insisted mattered more than flash. I thought, standing at that podium, about mentioning none of it, giving the standard gracious thanks to my kitchen team, to Marisol, to the servers who'd carried Rialto through some of its hardest nights. And then, almost without planning to, I added one more line, looking out at Desmond in the audience. And to everyone who's ever had to fight to make sure the truth of what they built stayed intact, I see you, and I hope you keep fighting. I don't know if anyone else in that room understood what I meant by it. Desmond did. I watched his face when I said it, and I watched him understand, fully, for the first time perhaps, the exact weight of what he'd nearly taken from me. I renegotiated our operating agreement again that year, with Selena's help, adding a clause that Desmond himself signed without argument this time: no membership transfer of any kind, to any party, under any circumstances, without written consent from all current members, delivered and reviewed while all members are conscious, competent, and given no fewer than 30 days to consider the request. I insisted on the 30-day clause specifically, and Desmond understood exactly why, without my needing to explain it further. I think about that hospital bed often, the version of myself lying there with a breathing tube taped to my cheek, utterly unaware that 12 minutes away, my husband was trying to give away something I'd spent 14 years and 80-hour weeks building. What strikes me most, looking back, is that the thing that actually saved Rialto wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a clever legal trick I engineered in the moment. It was 14 years of quiet, patient accumulation, sweat equity clauses filed correctly year after year, an accountant I trusted enough to call the moment something felt wrong, an operating agreement built carefully enough at the start that it could withstand even a betrayal I never saw coming. The protection was already there, built years before I ever needed it, the same way a well-run kitchen survives a single bad night because of everything you did right on all the nights before it. There are still mornings, even now, 18 months later, when I catch myself checking the LLC's filing status online, for no particular reason, just to see the 62% still sitting there in black and white, still mine, still accurate. I don't know if that habit will ever fully fade, and I've stopped expecting it to. Some scars just become part of how carefully you check the locks going forward, and I've decided there's nothing wrong with that. Vigilance, earned the hard way, isn't the same thing as fear. It's simply what competence looks like after it's been tested. Priscilla still keeps our books, and I still call her first whenever anything about Rialto's paperwork feels even slightly unfamiliar, a habit I don't think I'll ever fully let go of again. Selena remains on retainer, something Desmond never questions or resents, understanding, I think, that it's no longer optional for me, the way it once might have felt like an unnecessary expense. Julian and I have rebuilt a cautious, distant kind of civility, mostly for the sake of family gatherings, though I doubt we'll ever be close. And I've made my peace with that. Some relationships survive a betrayal by fully healing. Others survive simply by both parties agreeing to hold enough space between them that the wound doesn't get reopened. Ours is the second kind. I think about Odile sometimes too, my old mentor in Lyon, long since passed, and I wonder what she'd say if she could see the way her old lesson about reading a P&L statement ended up saving an entire marriage's worth of what I'd built. I think she'd say what she always said, in that clipped, unsentimental way of hers. The kitchen only ever protects the people who understand exactly what they own inside it. Everyone else is just cooking on borrowed time. If you've ever discovered that someone you trusted made a major decision about your life without you, in a moment when you couldn't defend yourself, I hope you remember this. The quiet, boring work of protecting what's yours. The paperwork, the documentation, the percentages nobody thinks to check until they desperately need to, is rarely glamorous, and it is almost always what actually saves you when the moment comes. Build your protections before you need them. You won't always get to choose when the test arrives. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story meant something to you, drop a comment below and subscribe for more stories about the quiet women who finally stop apologizing for what they've built. I'll see you in the next one.